So today I want to talk to you about the Enduring Issues essay, and in particular I want to talk about a really important component that a lot of people tend to miss, and that's CCOT. So the most important part of understanding the Enduring Issues essay is figuring out what an enduring issue is, finding at least 3 documents that share one enduring issue, and then clearly identifying and defining the issue. And we're still working on improving that part, but we've gotten a lot better. The second most important part of the Enduring Issues essay is understanding what they want from you for continuity and change over time, or CCOT. So remember, this is an enduring issues essay. Most people get caught up on the issues part. They find an issue in 3 of the documents, and then they use the documents to give examples of the issue and basically just point out that there is an issue and it exists. And that's a good start, but that's not enough. So enduring means lasting, as in enduring through the ages, lasting across time. So to show that this issue is enduring, you have to show continuity and change over time. I know we've gone over this before, but even if you think you know this well, you might still need a refresher. So continuity means staying the same, as in to continue, continuous, that's continuity. Change means change. So over time means in different times and perhaps different places in history. So to show continuity and change over time, you need to look through the documents, the ones ideally that you've identified as being related to your enduring issue, and you want to look through those documents for similarities and differences between the way that the issue is playing out in different time periods, and try to see if you can make a case that the similarity in 2 different time periods represents proof that the issue has continued in a similar way over time, or that a difference between 2 time periods represents proof that the issue has changed in some way over time. So in its simplest form, CCOT looks a lot like comparing and contrasting, but it's comparing and contrasting between different time periods. But that's a bit of an oversimplification. And that approach is good as a way to start, to see kind of what you have available, but it's not always going to produce the clearest and the cleanest examples to use. So let's try to look at more of an ideal scenario and then work our way from there. So in a perfect situation, you would find 2 documents from what you were given that don't only deal with the same enduring issue, but also take place in the same location. Location is probably the most ideal situation, but it could also be the same culture or society or some other very important connection. One would be earlier, and one would be later on. So if we use location as an example, let's say you have 2 documents, they both take place in Italy. One of them is taking place during the time of ancient Rome, and another one is taking place during the Renaissance. The documents might not explicitly say that they're both in Italy, but if one is taking place in the city of Rome and another one is taking place in Venice or Florence, then you might be able to make that connection based on your outside knowledge that, hey, these are both in Italy. This might be some kind of similarity or difference over time, a continuity or change over time. So whatever your enduring issue is, if things are looking pretty much the same in both time periods, then you could argue that the issue is continuous, that it has endured in the same way between 2 time periods. If they've changed, you could argue that there's been a shift over the course of time in the way this issue has expressed itself. I'll give you another example. Let's say you don't have the same location in 2 different documents, but there is something else that connects the document. So how about religion? Let's say maybe 2 of the documents deal with different locations. One's in India, one's in Japan, but they both deal with Buddhist communities. So that fact that they're both dealing with how Buddhism has done in history, or the Buddhist societies in history, you could still establish a continuity and change over time among Buddhist societies, among Buddhist communities. So if it's relevant to your enduring issue, let's say your enduring issue is the impact of religion on art. So let's say you can look for similarities and differences between those 2 time periods. And if you see, okay, I'm looking at Indian Buddhist art, I'm looking at Japanese Buddhist art. And if things are different, right, you could say, oh wow, this looks like perhaps things have changed between the 2 time periods. And you can use this as evidence of change over time. You could say that in the earlier styles of Buddhist art, they were a certain way, but over time they've evolved. And now the ones you're looking at in Japan represent a later period of Buddhist art, and you can look at differences in the way that religion is expressed through art. You could also make an argument for continuity and say that while changes have occurred, the tradition of using art to express Buddhist faith has continued through the ages. And so this can actually bring up another tip. You'll also often find that changes occur with the more specific parts of the issue, while the broader, more general parts of things are what stay the same. So it's not always the case, but that is very common. So in this case, maybe the specific method of doing the art, maybe the style, maybe maybe the medium is different, but the idea that they are using art to express their faith is the more general thing, and that has still stayed the same. That has continued despite some of those more specific changes. And you can and you should identify both continuity and change if you can. You don't need to say there's all change, it's all change, or it's all continuity. The more you can find, the more you can include in there, the more thorough your analysis will seem to be. It only shows you're being more analytical. So another lesson we can look at this example of Buddhist art we can pull from this is, like I said before, if you can find two documents from the same location, like we said about Italy, you can make a really strong case that there has definitively been some change or some continuity over time. Right? If they're coming from different places, like this example with India and Japan, you could still use them, but it might not be as strong of an example. Here's what I mean. We mentioned using Buddhist art, India from an earlier date, and Buddhist art in Japan from a later date. And we said you could argue for change over time. You could say that over time, Buddhist art has become different. But those are two different places. So it's possible that in India, Buddhist art never changed. Perhaps the Indian styles are the Indian styles, and the Japanese styles are the Japanese styles. And that rather than showing a change over time, this just shows differences between the way different cultures interpreted Buddhism. So it's possible that this really doesn't represent a change over time. And that would really depend on whether or not you happen to know some of the finer points about Buddhist art around the world, which it's very possible that you don't, and that's okay. But how do you deal with this fact that it's possible that these two examples don't really reflect a change over time? So what do you do? Do you throw it out? I would argue no. It might not be perfect, but neither are the people making the Regents exams, and that's not your fault. Do you just go with it? Do you just kind of try to ignore some of the flaws in your argument and just push forward? Yeah, you could do that. I think most of the time, if you at least show that something could conceivably be a legitimate example, they will appreciate that, the graders will appreciate that, and they'll probably give you credit for it. But there's also a third option, and I think this is the best option if you're up for it, and that is to use it, but rather than ignore some of those problems, some of those flaws, some of those questionable connections, acknowledge them. Acknowledge the flaws in your argument. If you do it right, it's actually going to sound really advanced. So how do you do this? Basically, make the case for CCOT that you otherwise make. Say, yeah, this is this older Indian Buddhist art, this is this later Japanese Buddhist art. They're not the same, and I think that shows, or that seems to show, that there is a change over time in Buddhist art. But then you hit them with a however, and then you explain why it's possible that this may not represent CCOT, depending on unknown information that the documents don't address. You could say that, all right, given the available information, it is or it isn't reasonable to conclude that this represents a potential example of CCOT. This is called qualifying your argument, meaning kind of openly pointing out some of the limitations or the exceptions to your argument. And being open like that is actually a sign of intellectual honesty, and it shows that you weren't hiding the flaws, and also shows that you didn't fail to notice them. You picked up on those flaws, and rather than pretending they're not there, you're going to address them, you're going to acknowledge them, and that's only going to make you sound more analytical to say, this seems to be an example of continuity and change over time. Because it's from a different location, it's possible that it does not represent a change, but given the available information, it's very likely that this is the case, or there's a strong possibility that this could be the case. It's okay to do that. Now, that example assumes that you don't know anything of outside information that could clarify things. Maybe you don't know about later Indian art, but what if you do? What if there's a situation where you've learned something in class, and it can actually add more to your understanding, it can actually fill in the blanks where the documents are silent? Well, that's where outside information comes from, right? In your essay, you are required to include outside information. You rely on the documents primarily to decide your enduring issue and to support your arguments, but you're required to bring in outside information as well, as much as you can, really, whether it be a little extra detail to add on to the examples from the documents to kind of just flesh them out a little bit. So I would call that little OI. Or it could be an entirely new example that could have been a document itself had the creators of the essay thought to include it. That's what I call big OI, a whole new separate example. So you can and you should use OI in your first body paragraph as well when you're focusing on explaining the issue and giving examples of it. But outside info can also be really useful in the CCOT component, which is mainly going to take place in your second body paragraph. So maybe we could go back to the example of Italy that we mentioned earlier. If you have one document that is from ancient Rome Italy and another document from the Renaissance Italy. If we're talking about the same enduring issue, let's say we're doing the impact of religion on art, just like we were talking about with Buddhism. So we might find in that example that during both of these time periods, during the classical Roman times and during the Renaissance, it was very common for people to create sculptures of Greco-Roman gods, Venus and Jupiter, Mars, and that these sculptures were often nude. We've recently been talking about the Renaissance, and I'm sure you guys are aware of that. So if you only had those two documents and you didn't have any outside information, somebody might look at that and conclude that, oh wow, this seems to represent an uninterrupted continuity between the art of Italy from the classical to early modern times, right? Wow, it looks like if they were making naked statues of Greek and Roman gods in the classical times and they were making naked statues of Greek and Roman gods in the Renaissance times, I'm going to assume that they've always done that. And they did that the entire time in between. And that shows that this was continuous. But this is where your outside information would be very helpful, because you might remember learning in class that the Renaissance was a revival, right? A return to Greek and Roman art styles that had stopped being practiced during the long centuries of the Middle Ages. Due to the growth of Christianity in Italy and elsewhere in Europe, people had stopped believing in the Roman gods and no longer wanted to create sculptures of them, focusing instead on Christian figures like Jesus, Mary, the saints. Also, medieval Christian views of morality made it so that they were very opposed to nudity in statues, and so that became uncommon as well. And it was only during the Renaissance that people started to create nude sculptures again. And while they also depicted Christian figures, we talked about David, the statue of the prophet, and King David, many depictions of Jesus throughout the Renaissance. There was also a return to depictions of the Roman pagan gods, even if they didn't believe in them anymore. So this really shows you the importance of outside info. It's not just there to get a point on the rubric. Having that outside information can really fill in the blanks that the documents leave, and it can really allow you to, in this case, it totally changed the argument from continuity to change. We thought originally, based on the documents, that the Italians had always been making naked statues of Greek and Roman gods, and with that outside information, we realized they had been making such statues, naked, pagan. Then they changed with the introduction of Christianity to making Christian religious art and not making things nude. And then in the Renaissance, they changed again, returning back to the older styles. So without that outside information, we would have missed that entire piece of the conversation, that entire piece of the topic. And so outside information is really valuable and can really take your argument to the next level, in addition to getting you the points that, I covered my bases, I included something from the outside. So by including that piece of knowledge, it totally changed the argument from continuity to change, and it made it way more complex and more interesting. In fact, you could still argue here for continuity despite that change. Like we said before, the general tends to be more continuous, the specifics tend to be more changing. So we could still argue for continuity, because even though the subject of the art may have changed with the change in beliefs, it shows that Italians continued to use art to express their religious devotion for one religion or another. Oh, and just a reminder about outside information, you never ever quote outside information. I understand that since you're writing this at home and you're preparing in advance, you may be looking up information about your topics to include as outside info, and that's fine. That's great. Do some background research, clarify some things. But remember, you are treating this like an essay test. So as silly as it may seem, even though you found something online or in a textbook, you should not cite it, right? Imagine you were on the test and you cited something from a textbook. They would say, how did you get a textbook into this test? So you certainly cannot quote things or write things word for word. In fact, I will say you cannot even paraphrase, because paraphrasing is very much like quoting, and you're still borrowing someone else's wording. You're just modifying it a little bit. That's still something that would normally need to be cited. So I want you to think of it this way. On the real Regents exams, you will only have the documents and your own memory, the knowledge you've stored in your head from what you learned in class. So outside info always needs to be in your own words. For now, it's fine to brush up on your history so you have more to use, more to draw from, more outside information to include, but don't go straight from the source to the essay. I recommend taking notes on the outside sources that you might use for prep in order to filter out the wording and just get the facts, so that when you go and write your essay, you're not tempted to borrow someone else's phrasing. It's your own words, because you're only basing it off the information that you gained from these sources originally. I can tell you that if you do plagiarize, probably won't make much sense in your essay, and it's going to come across as confusing and off topic and out of place. This is pretty much always what we see when people try to plagiarize, so it's really just not worth it in any sense. One last thing I have to mention, because even though I said this before, it seems like people keep defaulting to this. When you are trying to show examples of CCOT CCOT, please do not make connections to today. I'm sorry, just don't do it. While technically you are allowed to do it in these essays, I'm telling you, save it for the conclusion. If it actually turns out to be a really good connection with some detailed explanation, then terrific, you'll get credit for it. But most of the time, people are just making like vague general statements that don't contribute to the argument. Worst of all, if you include it in the body of your essay, it's gonna waste space that could have and should have been used for connections between different points in history. Remember, you can do CCOT between one document and another document, or between a document and outside info, but for the body of the essay, stick to history we've studied in class. Why? Because it's something you actually know about in detail, and we can both be comfortable and confident that this is something you've learned about accurately and thoroughly. In a conclusion, you can feel free to make comparisons to later history we haven't studied. You want to talk about World War II? If it makes sense, go for it. You want to talk about the internet and modern day, that's great. At least the essay is already done, so it's low risk. And a conclusion is actually an interesting place for that, because now you're drawing even bigger connections, even further connections beyond the topic of the essay, beyond the examples in the essay, and showing how this enduring issue continues to endure. But again, you're doing it in a safer way, where if you don't really have all the details, you don't really have all the specifics, it's okay. It's just the conclusion. So to end this, here's your essay, put as simply as possible. You have your intro, introduce and clearly define your enduring issue. You have your first body paragraph, where you should be using the documents and the outside information to show different ways that the issue occurs throughout history. The second body paragraph is where you're going to make connections between the documents and outside information to show how the issue has endured, how it has continued or changed, or both, over time, throughout the history you've studied. And then in your conclusion, you connect back to your enduring issue, and you can feel free to include connections to more recent history and the present. Also remember that a body paragraph is not a set number of sentences. It's not like it can only be 5 sentences or 7 sentences or 9 sentences. A paragraph is just a way to divide your essay, make it however many sentences it needs to be to say what you need to say. Final number 1 advice for the essay: never stray away from your enduring issue. If you realize your enduring issue doesn't work, go back and start over with a better enduring issue. You have to stick with it throughout. Well, I hope this was helpful. Have fun prepping and writing your essays. Peace out.